In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the figure of Florence Nightingale, who's the single most important person in the history of nursing, as many of you will already know, and I suspect many of you have already studied her in the context of your education. So Florence Nightingale is probably one of the most famous people in the world, even 200 years after her birth. And this is partly because she's sitting at a nexus of a number of different aspects of our culture right now. So women's history, so she's included on a lot of sites that have to do with women's history, nursing history, history of medicine, military history. So she's been influential in public health. So all of these areas, nursing education. And so when you go looking, she's everywhere. So almost every nursing school website I've come across has a lot to say about her. So she's clearly just an absolutely central figure. And I will be looking at some of her ideas, but I'll also be highlighting some of her religious ideas, because I think that is one aspect that often doesn't get looked at in these other forums. So who was Florence Nightingale? She was born into a wealthy English family. On her father's side, they were landowners, so gentry, and on her mother's side, wealthy merchants. And so she was born in Florence, where her family were on an extended vacation. So she was named after the city she was born in. She was born in Italy. And then when they returned, she was given a typical education for a woman at the time. And so many of you will know at this time in countries like England and later in Canada, women had very few rights. They were not permitted to go to university. They couldn't hold degrees. They couldn't practice professions like law and so on. So very kind of, even for upper class women, it would be a very limited scope. And so it, as would have been typical of the time, she would have just been expected to make a good marriage with somebody of a similar class to herself. So what becomes different here? So this is even before that early feminist movement starts to build in the Victorian period. And so we're told that she received a divine calling. So she has a sense that she's meant to do something with her life, and that will give her this sense of meaning and purpose. And we're told, according to her biography, and this is completely believable, that her parents were absolutely appalled because a woman of her social position was not expected to work. And so the idea of her working, they really pushed back against this for many, many years, the idea of her moving outside of a family setting. And also this sort of social setting we're going to see is very similar to what we see with Cicely Saunders. And it's worth thinking about. I don't pretend to know why they're so similar, but definitely this idea of pushing against what's expected of you as a woman, what's expected of you for your social class. And we're told also that particularly wanting to go into nursing, this would have been seen as something unheard of. And I've actually heard of this in the 1950s, that families would object because it was almost seen as being a servant. So, taking care of people. So she's sort of kicking against the traces in a number of different ways when she starts wanting to have a career outside of her home. So Florence Nightingale actually was known for writing a great deal. So we have a lot of information about her, and unlike a lot of the other topics I'm covering in this course, there's a lot written on Florence Nightingale. So we know from her letters and her writings that she had some kind of what we would call, I don't know if you call it a conversion experience or kind of a call, when she was around 16 years old. So according to her own account, I have the quote here. "I don't think any words had a fuller possession of my mind through life than Christ putting himself in the place of the sick, the infirm, and the prisoner." And so at this age, she has the sense of vocation, so of being called by the divine to do this work in the world. And it's often been said in religious studies, when we look at world cultures, that can become one of the only ways that women can override that cultural limitation, right? So we saw with the nursing orders that those women were playing administrative roles and political roles that they would not have been able to do if they had been in a purely secular setting. So in a sense, this overriding idea of that this is a call from God allows them to, it also gives them the confidence, I think, to move forward on their what they want to do. And we can see this goes right back to the very first lecture about the early Christian communities and the idea from the Gospel of Matthew that you're to work with the sick, the infirm, and the prisoner. And so while Florence Nightingale would have been Church of England Anglican, she's not Catholic. Obviously, same book, so these are Christian ideals. And would be very hard for her parents, if they say they're Christian, to argue with. So it becomes also a very effective way of arguing for this. And so apparently she refused a proposal of marriage, and her parents eventually relented and allowed her to go and train. So one of the first things that she does is she makes visits to Paris and to Germany, so France and Germany. And I find it very interesting, and as somebody who works in religious studies, not surprising that almost all the biographical material just skirts this whole, they just give it one line. But what she does is she goes to France and works with the Sisters of Mercy. And so she's developing in her own mind what this is going to look like. So she's looking at best practices that exist. So she goes to work with the Sisters of Mercy in Paris, and this would have been a nursing order. So I'm not going to talk about that because I already did a whole lecture on that. But the other place she goes to is Germany, and she works with what are called the deaconesses of Kaiserwerth. And so this is a Protestant form of a nursing order. And so many people have not heard of this. It was founded by Theodore and Frederica Fladner. He was a Lutheran pastor and his wife, and they developed this idea of the deacon. And so I talked at some length about deacons in those first lectures. So this is a continuation. And so I think it's very instructive that these practices continue over a millennia, essentially. And in a sense, the role of the deacon has been revived beginning in the Victorian time within Protestantism, because with the Reformation, the Protestant tradition does away with the monasteries and the convents, so there's sort of no place that these orders are being trained. So this is one of the first sort of early versions of training nurses, and so it was done in Germany under the auspices of the Lutheran Church. And so Florence Nightingale goes to train with these deaconesses in Germany. So she's drawing on both a Catholic and a Protestant approach to nursing. It was actually a former student of mine that introduced me to some of the intricacies of Florence Nightingale's philosophy of nursing, and so the idea of these dimensions of care. And it's very clear that nursing from this point, and probably from the beginning, was more open to what we would refer to as holistic care. And without a doubt, nurses have been, in my experience anyway, open to various forms of alternative healing as well. And so we see with Florence Nightingale, and this is why she's also important in the annals of public health, that she was very concerned with all the things around healing. So it wasn't just about, for instance, performing a surgery. So the environment the person's living in, hygiene, cleanliness, natural light, all of these things are part of what becomes standard nursing practice and teaching. So I just want to look at from her notes on nursing. So another thing she did was start to write about this. And so again, it's hard to overestimate how important this is, because we know that medical doctors have been writing case histories and writing about it since the time of the ancient Greeks, like Hippocrates and Galen. But within nursing, really, in my understanding, nothing was written down. And this is partly I would argue because it wasn't taken as seriously. So we see Florence Nightingale taking it seriously, writing this down for people to read as part of curriculum. And so this is what she has to say in Notes on Nursing. Surgery removes the bullet out of the limb, which is an obstruction to cure, but nature heals the wound. So definitely situating, which would be very similar to the way medicine is approached by Hippocrates, that ancient Greek tradition of recognizing the role of the natural environment around you, but also that your body is part of nature and that really you're just facilitating the natural healing of the body. So it is with medicine. The function of an organ becomes obstructed. Medicine, so far as we know, assists nature to remove the obstruction, but does nothing more. So there's a kind of fundamental humility here in her approach, that all of the nursing is around supporting what the natural curative powers of the human body. And what nursing has to do in either case is to put the patient in the best condition for nature to act upon him. And so we find within the teaching of Florence Nightingale that she's very, she talks a great deal about all of these dimensions of the person that then contribute to their healing, including their mental outlook, and as well as those more practical aspects of nursing. So even though, as with all medicine in places like Canada, the technical aspects have really come to the fore in our time period, nursing has kind of stubbornly maintained this emphasis, and I think it is under a lot of strain, and I hope we can talk about it in the discussion boards, but definitely Nightingale is clear that all of these aspects have to be paid attention to. The turning point in Florence Nightingale's career, and really a turning point in history in a sense, as we're going to see, is the Crimean War, which breaks out in 1853, and the British are fighting in an area which is now contested between Ukraine and Russia. And so it is during the Crimean War she becomes known as the Lady with the Lamp, which and she becomes a kind of icon of nursing. And I would argue even to this day she's kind of the icon of nursing in a lot of people's minds. And so in the beginning the army did not want her there, and so she had to push, and apparently she was referred to as unfeminine and a nuisance by a number of the military elite that were organizing the British forces. But she insisted on going because she had heard of the conditions for the soldiers there. And so in one of her biographies it says, "How Florence Nightingale's hygiene crusade saved millions." And so during this period, as she's dealing with what she's, kind of the card she's dealt, this becomes a pattern going forward for any form of nursing, and also during wartime, which is obviously the worst time to be a doctor or nurse. So she takes a group of nurses with her. She puts together this group of nurses, and some are secular, but also she calls upon the Irish Sisters of Mercy. So again, we see this coming together, as we're going to see in hospice care, of these ideals emerging out of that pre-existing tradition, and then Florence Nightingale's bringing in more of the scientific, technical aspects of nursing. So they start to come together in the figure of Florence Nightingale. So she goes to Crimea, and what she finds there is, as we now know, completely horrifying. And what she finds is that the soldiers are dying mostly of the conditions around them, not necessarily of their wounds. So they're dying of things like typhoid, they're dying of dysentery, so things that can be dealt with through hygiene. And so according to the accounts, she and her nurses, the first thing they did was they went to work scrubbing every inch of the facilities that they were working in. They established a laundry, and she was also fundraising. So again, we see that incredible energy. So she's also getting money, she's getting donations to come in to pay for all of this. And so so we're told that as a result, the mortality rates dropped by probably around 40%. So just unbelievable success in this case. And so clearly she becomes famous at this time. Even the Queen of England is paying attention to her. And so in the London Times, she's referred to as a ministering angel. So this idea of, we've talked about this in the discussion boards, that she's occupying a role that society accepts for women. So it's not completely, she's not seen as completely walking, moving outside of what's acceptable for women. But without a doubt, she's called a trailblazer, and so are the nurses that went with her. And so when we say trailblazer, that idea of opening up a path for others to follow. And so really, it's in this, at this very challenging time in the Crimean War, where she walks right into the fire, that it establishes a lot of her thinking about what nursing is going to look like and what nursing training is going to look like going forward. There are many ways to approach the work of Florence Nightingale because it's such a vast body of work, and I kind of do know where she got the energy. She had that zeal, that Victorian religious zeal that was motivating her, but she was extremely active in a wide variety of areas. So one important one was changes made to St. Thomas's Hospital. So according to their website, the hospital had existed from the 12th century, and in London on the Thames River, but with the ideas of Florence Nightingale, it gets rebuilt, and it starts in 1872, and so she oversees the rebuilding of the premises so that it reflects her principles of nursing, which is referred to on the website as pavilion style. So 7 large separate buildings connected by walkways. She recognized the importance of design for improving hygiene and health. So even in terms of the design of buildings, she's involved in that. And part of this is that hospital will then become the site of training for nurses. And so she starts developing curriculum for nursing. And so a very important person in this history is Lynn MacDonald, who's done a lot of work collecting her writings and so on. She's a professor at University of Guelph, and I will be attaching this document. She's just done so much work putting this all in one place. So MacDonald has also looked at Nightingale's faith and the influence that it had on her work. And so her argument is that there's a strain of Methodism in Florence Nightingale. I don't want to get too far into this, but it's a stream within Anglicanism that's much more activist and social justice oriented. And so this was also part of what was influencing her. And so in terms of nursing education, we find also that for Florence Nightingale, despite her religious beliefs, for her nursing is secular. Nurses should be coming from all backgrounds. They should be working with people of all backgrounds. So it was much more just her providing her motivation. It wasn't necessarily coloring the nursing itself. And so we find that her approach to nursing, for instance, that nurses would be trained regardless of social class or educational background or any other aspect of their background. So there we see that very clearly, the idea that religious background isn't important. So training was to be fundamentally on the apprenticeship model, hands-on in the wards with other nurses, so with senior nurses, which would be also typical for a medical doctor. Classes given by medical doctors augmented by training. So that idea of in-class training supplemented by work on the ward. So the idea of a home sister or mistress of probationers organizing the training under the matron. District nurses had to be hospital trained. So there's the idea of all the different arms of nursing. So whether they're working in the community, whether they're working in a hospital, that they all have this standard training and they learn things like hygiene and so on. And so also the idea of midwifery, she was very influential in terms of getting that into alignment with the standard curriculum of nursing. So I think you can see very clearly why she's so important. Obviously, I'm just touching on it, but if any of you want to work on this as your final essay paper, you're welcome to do that. There's quite a lot of information available on her, unlike with the Catholic nursing orders. So I wanted to end with this image, which I found very touching, actually, which is from 2020. The Houses of Parliament in England were lit up on International Nurses' Day. So the day obviously was for all nurses, but it was on the birthday of Florence Nightingale, so that's her image also projected onto the Houses of Parliament. And so it would project her date of birth, and then it would projected this: "Our nation thanks those who care." And so this came obviously right at the height of the COVID pandemic, when healthcare workers were leaping into the fray. And I'm sure many of you know cases. I personally know cases. There was a woman I was working with at the Nipissing Serenity Hospice who was just about to retire when COVID hit, and basically immediately leapt into the fray and was organizing all the different clinics in North Bay to get shots to people. And I know there's he was a former dean at Nipissing who hadn't been a practicing nurse for many years, Rick Vanderlee, but he went in and started giving vaccinations. So it was really, you could really see this traditional approach of dedication and service. We all saw it, doctors too, of course, during COVID. And so I think it's fantastic that in England they created this tribute both to Florence Nightingale and to nurses everywhere.